Here is Monteverde Gratitude. And as a magenta, it can be seen in the chromatography that there is a pink undertone. The writing sample looks like the swatch, only noticeably lighter. This gives a fairly consistent tone as paper changes, with the difference only noticeable when you're looking at them in a side by side. There is a little bit of shading, but only a little, and not as a standout quality at all. On non-fountain pen friendly paper, the color and general performance is okay, as feathering doesn't seem to be an issue, but it does get deep into the paper. Likely not the best choice for student note takers. Would I like a bottle of this though? Yes. The tone it just draws me in, and I really do like it. I didn't expect to like it, but it again draws me in as the best I can explain it. So I can happily see inking pens with this just for an intense day of writing.
The pen for today is a Pelikan M800. And now that we know my opinion on this ink, let's see how we got there by looking at the first writing sample done on Clairfontaine.
Draws me in. That's what I see when I see this. There's no feather, there's no spread, there is shading. Take a look at 3 or 3. The top one, you see the H is much darker than the whole rest of the word. This bottom one, you see the H is again much darker than the rest of the word, along with the E's. Where it looks like it's, remember, I'm rubbing my fingers over stuff, and this is a coated paper. Very much we see what looks more like a mid-tone with occasional spots of shading that I think show a little bit more here on this bright white paper than on some other papers. Looking at the back of the page, we get no bleeding and no ghosting.
Monteverde makes more than just one ink, so let's take a look at a few other inks from Monteverde.
Here is Monteverde Azur Noir. Here is Monteverde Smoke Noir. Here is Monteverde Lion. Here is Monteverde Black Ash.
The second writing sample is done in a Portage Reporter notebook.
Here we can see that the tone is just the tiniest bit lighter than it is on the Clairfontaine. It does not feather, does not spread, does shade, not as well as it did on the Clairfontaine, but there are a couple spots of it. Just take a look at this and Gibbs on the first line. This is slightly darker than Gibbs right next to it, but for the most part, what we see is a fairly uniform tone that looks very nice on the page. Again, drawing me into it, looking at it. Beautiful tone. Looking at the back of the page, we don't have a problem with ghosting. There are just a couple of spots that got deeper into the page. It did not bleed through to touch the page underneath, and I don't think these spots would likely stop you from writing back here.
There's a lot to be learned by doing multiple chromatographies. The one on the left is done the way it's supposed to be done. A line of ink is put down to immediately put into water to show the separation of those colors, making the ink. Now the one on the right is marked with a D. This is allowed to dry for 10 minutes before it's put into water. The third writing sample is done in a national brand Steno notebook.
Here the tone is a bit lighter than it is on the Clairfontaine. I think shows a little bit more of that pink undertone than we had. Likely a result of the tone of the paper, meaning this ink is probably a little bit translucent. It does have little bits of feathering that do occur, which are always a problem for me. Feathering is one of the first things I look at. Actually, then bleed becomes the second thing. It's feathering, then bleed in my criteria for looking at an ink. It does look nice. It does have minor spread that's going on. The feathering and a spread mean to me this is likely not a good combination of an ink here. There is some shading that goes on. Take a look at question on the third line, but it is the minor feathering and the minor spread together that make me say no to this combination. Looking at the back of the page, we didn't have a problem with ghosting. We do have a problem with over penetration, not to the point of bleeding to the page underneath, but it definitely shows this a lot, which explains what's going on with that feathering. This, I probably would not be writing on the back of this page for fear of making both sides of my notes ugly.
Resistance tests are done to see how well this ink can be expected to perform on the page, and more importantly, how hard it may be to clean from your pen. Now, this smear is allowed to dry for 3 days before testing it. In the upper left, you can see where there is highlighter. In the upper right, that is pen flush. The lower left has a 1/3 bleach solution, and the lower right has plain old water. The next writing sample is done in a Rhodia notebook.
Here we get the same tone as the Clairfontaine. It does not feather, does not spread, does only have a couple of spots of shading that we know of, like no on the second line, where the KN is just a little bit darker than the OW at the end. Mostly, this looks fairly uniform in tone. It does stand out against the quad rule without any kind of a problem. And because it's the tone that really draws me in, I can deal with it not being as shading in ink. This is a gorgeous tone, and I would be so happy to have a bottle of gratitude. Fitting, I'm just being nerdy. Looking at the back of the page, no problem for ghosting. Unfortunately, a couple of spots where it is deeper into the paper. Not to the spot that probably stops most people from writing back here. But the fact that it is getting deeper into the paper is something to be aware of as its own warning sign.
With over 1,000 inks reviewed, let's take a look at a few more magenta inks.
Here is Birmingham Pen Company Fort Pitt Blockhouse Sepia.
Here is Noodler's Saguaro Wine.
Here is Pilot Susuji or Azalea. Here is Sailor Kobe No. 6 Bordeaux.
All of the inks that you just saw have a review here on the channel. Now, the next writing sample is done in a composition lab notebook.
Here the tone is a little bit lighter and flatter than it is on the Clairfontaine, perhaps showing a little bit of that pink undertone a little bit more. It doesn't feather, doesn't spread, doesn't shade nearly as well as it did in the Clairfontaine. However, this tone still really draws me in incredibly well. The fact that the pink undertone is showing slightly more, I feel like on this paper really makes it great to use. It looks like no other color. What an amazing thing. Like, I can see this with a deep dark purple together on the page being absolutely amazing as a combination for a student. Looking at the back of the page, no bleeding, no ghosting, great. Always shows how good this paper truly is for students.
While it's nice to see inks that are in the same color family, I prefer to find inks that complement the color on the page.
Here is Montegrappa Blue Black or Dark Blue. Here is Diamine Sparkling Shadows.
Here is Montegrappa Harry Potter Hufflepuff.
Here is Diplomat Black.
The best way you can support this or any channel that you like watching is to alert the retailer of where you saw the product at time of purchase. Now, the last writing sample is done on 20-pound copy paper.
Here we get the same tone as the Clairfontaine. It doesn't feather. It does have a normal amount of spread for being on copy paper. It does not shade. It does look pretty okay. I think the flatter paper makes it less interesting, more of the paper than the ink. I like what I'm seeing. I think this is a great corrective ink for teachers to use. Looking at the back of the page, we don't have a problem with ghosting, but in the print style writing, it does get deeper into the paper. Never to the point of bleeding through to the other side, but it is that kind of thing to keep track of. As I've been saying, perhaps a drier, finer pen is a better choice here and would make it perfect on this paper.
So what nib and pen do I think are going to give the best writing experience with this ink?
The wet medium nib of the Pelikan M800 gives a nice magenta and just little bits of shading throughout. Off camera, I tried this in a dry medium to tone down the aggression on non-fountain pen friendly papers. The tone lightened, but still looked good, and the amount of shading was unchanged. Considering there wasn't a ton in the first place, it doesn't seem like a huge loss there unless you must have tons of shading, and I've become much more allowing of that as these reviews have gone on in my life. So, to keep any aggression under control, I say go for a dry fine, dry medium, maybe even a dry broad. Just check that first. And you can still get this great magenta tone with no worries about over penetrating on non-fountain pen friendly papers.